Hello, I'm Stuart Hillard, and today I'm going to show you how to do paper foundation piecing. It's a patchwork technique that I use a lot. It's very accurate and it's great for piecing awkward shapes and small pieces. It's a technique that I used for the quilt that's hanging behind me, Jubilee Jacks. And that's the pattern that's available in modern quilting in the June edition. I'm going to show you today how to piece the individual blocks, but also you can use this technique for any paper foundation piecing. In paper foundation piecing, we use a paper foundation and our finished block is the reverse of whatever we've got drawn, because we sew on the printed side or the drawn side. The fabric will be placed on the plain side. So we always sew on the lines, but our fabric is on the back. Just a word about settings for your machine. I like to use an open foot, zigzag foot for my sewing machine. I have a Bernina, so it's foot number 20, rather than using the regular 1/4 inch foot. This gives me better visibility. When you set your sewing machine up, the stitch length is very important. A regular stitch length is too long and you'll find the paper foundation very difficult to remove. So you want to shorten your stitch length. Now if you shorten it too much, and this stitch length is way down, your paper foundation will just perforate and tear way too easily and you'll struggle. You want something in between the two. But that's a little bit of trial and error. Just try it out on a piece of spare paper and see what's easy to tear but not so easy that the paper falls apart. Okay, so we're ready to start piecing. It's not important to cut your pieces of fabric really accurately. That's the great thing about foundation piecing. The pieces that you cut can be quite roughened and out of shape. We're going to trim them down. The sewing is what makes the block so accurate and the paper foundation. We start sewing in numerical order, and we're going to start with piece number 1, which is the red diagonal, and piece number 2, which is the white stripe next to it. And remember, I said that we always sew on the lines, but our fabric goes on the blank side. So our piece number 1 always goes right side up, pretty side up. And I want to make sure that that piece completely covers my first area. Hold it up to a light source to check that. Piece number 2 is my white stripe, and that goes right sides together. So I'm just going to place those two pieces together. I'm going to pop a pin in just to hold it in place. And then turn it over again and check. Hold it up to a light source and make sure that the seam line between foundation 1 and 2 is covered by both pieces of fabric. We're ready to sew. Okay, so I'm ready to sew my first seam line between patch 1 and 2, and I'm going to sew right on the line. Start and finish your sewing about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch either side of the seam line you want to sew. Okay, so I've sewn my first seam. I started and finished about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch away from my line that I was sewing. I'm going to flip my foundation over, and there are my fabrics, right sides together at the moment, and there's my seam that I've sewn. I'm going to flip open the patches, and I'm going to use my nail to crease that seam allowance down. I don't bother ironing at this stage. You can iron if you want. Don't use steam because the steam can distort the paper foundation. I'm ready to add my next patch. Before I do that, I'm going to show you how to trim your fabric down so that you reduce the bulk and you know where to put your next piece of fabric. So my next strip is going to go here, number 3. And at the moment there's a whole load of fabric hanging over the edge, and I want to get rid of that. So I'm going to use a piece of card, a postcard or a strip of card, and I'm going to put that on my next seam line. So this is between patch 1 and 3. I'm going to put the edge of my cardboard right on the seam line, and I'm going to fold the foundation back. Now I don't want to cut all of that fabric off because that includes my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to use a small ruler. You can use an add a quarter ruler. This is my Easy Dresden ruler. I'm going to line it up with a 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to trim that excess fabric away. So now I have a perfect 1/4 inch of fabric, and I know just where to put my next strip of fabric. Right sides together, pin it if you want to, and then we're going to sew on that line between 1 and 3. So I've added piece number 3, flipped it back, and used my nail to press it back. Now I'm going to trim between piece number 2 and piece number 4, or 3 and 4, or whichever the pattern shows. So I'm going to line my card up on my next seam line, fold my foundation back, use my ruler to add my seam allowance, and I'm going to trim that fabric away. Now sometimes on that very first patch you may find that you've got a little bit of the original fabric showing through, and if it was a dark fabric that would matter. If it was a lighter fabric it perhaps wouldn't. So before I go on, I'm just going to trim that away, and all I'm going to do to trim that away is just fold my foundation right back out of the way, and I'm going to trim that off. Now that red won't show through. So there's piece number 4, it's the blue triangle, right sides together, and my raw edges even with my trimmed edge and my new piece that I'm adding. Remember, we always sew on the printed side. So trim your threads and then flip back patch number 4 and finger press your seam allowance. We're getting there now. Is it starting to look like a Union Jack or part of one? I'm going to trim, ready for the next patch. and keep going in this way, trimming, stitching the next patch, trimming again, until you've added all of the patches. Once you've added all of the pieces in numerical order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, trim your foundation. Make sure you're adding 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. Most foundation patterns have that 1/4 inch seam allowance marked on them, but if you've drawn your own, make sure you draw your 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around your foundation. At this point you can press it using an iron, but don't use steam. You still don't want the foundation to be distorted. Leave your paper in at this point. Don't take it out until your whole block is made and your quilt is put together, your quilt top is put together. That will help to stabilise any bias edges. So here is one of the foundations made into a pillow. Slightly different foundation that I've used for demonstration, but you get the idea. So once you've made the whole block, or you've made it actually into your quilt top, that's when you would remove the paper. And I've started here. Just fold the paper back, and it should tear quite easily, just to remove those bits of paper. If you struggle to remove the paper, try reducing your stitch length or dampening the paper, and any little bits that get stuck you can use tweezers to pull those out. But generally, if you've used a short enough stitch length, those pieces of paper will come out nice and easily, and you'll be left with a really accurate pieced block. So that's how to do paper foundation piecing. Once you've made 4 blocks, 2A's and 2B's for the Jubilee Jacks quilt, you join them together with wide red strips. They make the centre cross in the flag. That's just regular piecing, that's not paper pieced at all, that section. It's very straightforward. I hope you've enjoyed my tutorial on paper piecing and it's helped. Watch the video lots of times to get those tips really clear in your mind, and practice paper piecing. It's always worth doing a test block before you start on your really precious fabrics. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson today, and maybe you'd like to come and spend the weekend or a week quilting in Yorkshire. I run quilting retreats. You can find my website at www.myquiltretreat.co.uk. We'd be very happy and glad to see you in Yorkshire.